Welcome, another episode of Prescription for Better Access, and thanks to all of our listeners for joining us. We're I can't believe it. We're getting like routinely over 1,500 listeners, so we must be doing something right here.
Yeah, we're number one in our niche, Mark.
Yeah, we are. Right. Well, it helps being the only one too. So
Yeah, right.
it's also great, I think, that we get to bring in, these incredible guests, and
Yeah,
that helps, doesn't it?
yes.
So I think today I'm excited about Steve. I know Steve personally, and of course I've been a big fan of pharma since my whole career has been sort of manufacturer focused. And so we're thrilled to welcome Steve Ubl join us, who's the president and CEO of PhRMA. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Scott. It's great to be with you guys. I've followed your work, and it's a pleasure to join the podcast.
Great. Well, we're really pleased to have you, and it's especially timely, with all the things going on in the industry and the government and so on. So we're really looking forward to getting into that with you.
It's just a quiet time in the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. It's a long list. Where do we start?
Yeah.
But speaking of starting, Steve, I do think it's important. You just recently announced that you're going to be leaving pharma. So I think that's important. But also for those listeners who don't know what pharma does, why don't you help us understand a little bit of the history and who your members are and help us understand the context?
Yeah, so pharma represents the innovative segment of the industry. As you probably know, there are other associations that represent the smaller emerging companies, bio, as well as the generic industry. But our members are the innovative segment. We have about 250 staff in DC with all the core disciplines that I'm sure you're aware of in terms of regulatory, market access. We have an office in China and Tokyo, so we operate on a global basis. We work on trade issues, Medicare, lots of policy development and advocacy, of course, engaging directly with members of Congress and the regulatory agencies.
Who would be some examples of your members, Steve?
All of the largest biopharmaceutical companies. So companies like Johnson & Johnson, Eli Lilly, Pfizer, Bristol Myers Squibb, and companies like that.
And they're not all U.S. based. Is that right?
No, we have companies based in Japan, in Europe. We also have a number of mid-sized companies as well. So it's not just large manufacturers, but mid-sized companies like Incyte, for example, Genmab, UCB, companies like that.
And you have a very interesting vantage point, obviously, across the industry, so many members and so many CEOs and government affairs folks and health policy folks you get to work with. Maybe just start out with like if you could, like a macro summation of like, you think, how would you describe the environment for the industry in the U.S. right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of the tale of two cities in the sense that we're seeing just incredible innovation in our space. I think the industry has never moved the needle more in terms of advancements in public health gains. I mean, we're seeing innovation that is biblical in nature. I mean, literally interventions that allow the blind to see, the deaf to hear, babies born with genetic diseases able to walk again. And I think if you look at cancer mortality, up to 70% of patients after 5 years cancer-free. So immunotherapies, cell and gene therapies, vaccine technology. We've really never seen greater strides in the advancement of public health. At the same time, there's a lot of policy headwinds. We've seen deep political polarization. When I worked on the Hill in the early 90s, members of Congress were like within their own 40-yard lines and would fairly routinely come to midfield and work on bipartisan healthcare solutions. Now most members are within their own 10-yard lines, rarely come out to midfield. Most health policies made through reconciliation, which is a single party legislative vehicle that's could be passed on a majority basis as opposed to the 60 vote threshold in the Senate. We have the rise of populism in both political parties, which is, again, on the Democratic side, you've seen a movement to more progressive policy positions, and Republicans have become populist in their own way. And, that's raised new challenges for the industry. I think the media environment, I'm sure you see this firsthand, has become very balkanized and fragmented, which makes it harder than ever to, puncture the din in Washington. And we have geopolitical change. I mean, you look at the rise of China, which I know we'll talk about in the context of our conversation, but whether it's most favored nation policies or tariffs, the rise of China, we're seeing pretty significant geopolitical change. And then AI. I mean, we're having a technological revolution at the same time. And again, I know we'll talk about how AI is going to profoundly impact our industry over time, but those are really macro changes that are buffeting the industry. At the same time, we're seeing these scientific advances based on knowledge of human biology that's so exciting.
So you have just so much going on there, Steve. I mean, that's just incredible. I know why you are traveling all around the world to take care of so much, but our focus obviously is around sort of drug pricing, market access, patient access, and patient affordability, right? So I want to sort of zero in there. And I know pharma's been very active over the last year in this effort. So could you tell us about your announcement about 6 months ago?
Thanks, Mark. We announced three exciting things in the last few months. One is, thanks in part to the administration's tax policies, our companies have announced $500 billion in new incremental investments in U.S. manufacturing in the United States. Importantly, these are investments across the country, and historically, it's been the case the industry has been domiciled in a few key clusters, whether that's Cambridge or South San Francisco or New Jersey or what have you. These investments are all over the country in places like Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Indiana, Texas, and so forth. And
not to mention Ohio.
Yeah, Ohio.
Scott, there you go, Columbus.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for the shout out, Mark.
Of course.
And, this industry really is a crown jewel of the U.S. economy. In terms of industries, our industry is very R&D intensive. We're a leading exporter. These investments are going to contribute to $1.2 trillion in overall economic output in the U.S. We have 5 million direct and indirect jobs in the industry. So, those investments are being well received by policymakers on both sides of the aisle. And then the second big announcement we made is that our patient assistance platform called MAT has now eclipsed helping over 10 million patients since its inception. And basically what it allows is patients to log onto a website, put into the search engine the medicine they're on, and it connects them to our company's financial assistance programs. Right. And then the third thing we just announced is really a complement to the financial assistance piece, which is direct-to-patient programs, which I know we'll talk about as an emerging trend in the industry. And so if there is a direct-to-patient program available by one of our companies, you'll be able to be connected there through the same website. So again, patient logs on, puts in their drug, they'll be directed to either financial assistance or a direct-to-patient program with the company.
Well, why don't we just dig in on that one a little bit, on the new direct-to-consumer models across the industry. We have the one you just mentioned from pharma. We've got the Trump RX initiative, obviously. Telehealth has been a growing presence. Cash pay pharmacies actually as well. Mark Cuban and others, all trying to, make a difference in the way patient access their medicines. What's your view on these things? Is this a big deal? Is it a niche deal? Is it a long-lasting thing or not?
I think it's a very important new development and new channel in terms of patient access for innovative medicines. I mean, obviously, it's not conducive to every type of medicine. I mean, if you have an infused cancer medicine, you're not going to use one of these platforms. But the reality is we have a very inefficient supply chain in the U.S., as you both know well. 50% of what's spent on brand medicine goes to somebody who didn't make it or develop it. And as a result, patients are paying these inflated prices And insurance just isn't what it used to be. Patients are oftentimes paying more if they access the medicine through their insurer than through one of these direct to patient platforms. So I think for certain medicines, particularly those that are highly rebated medicines, where the patient is not paying the net price after substantial rebates and discounts that our companies negotiate with PBMs and plans, for those medicines, patients are potentially better off getting the drug through one of these platforms than using their own insurance. And more needs to happen. I think for those platforms to really take off, what patients spend on those platforms should count towards their insurance. And I think there's a growing interest in policies that would support that as a complement, to insurance. So I think it's still a nascent, development, but an important one. And I think it's going to raise questions that I think will hopefully drive further reforms of the supply chain, right? I mean, if there's a medicine on one of these platforms that's, I'm making up, $300 and it costs you $600 to get it through your insurance, policymakers are going to begin to ask these questions about, well, why is that the case? So I do think, and I'm sure we'll talk about, PBMs and 340B and a lot of the reasons why we have an inefficient supply chain. But I think what you're seeing in these direct-to-patient programs is a bit of a workaround. The notion that health insurance, in a way, is becoming a lot like car insurance. Like everybody has to have it, but you don't want to use it because the pain points are becoming so significant. And some of the data from our companies bears this out, that patients would rather, even if they have insurance and it would be cheaper to buy the drug through insurance, they're accessing the medicine through these patient platforms, direct-to-patient platforms, because they're just more efficient and seamless, in terms of interacting with the healthcare system. So I think there's a lot of reasons that will put a tailwind behind these platforms. My son has type 1 diabetes, so I'm pretty close to the insulin market. And to me, that's a classic example of you have a lot of Americans in high deductible health plans. They're paying the full list price of the drug, even though, a plan or PBM might be getting a 50 to 80% discount. One other anecdote, I remember meeting with Senator Perdue. He's now ambassador to China, but he used to be the CEO of Reebok. And when we were talking about our supply chain, he's like, well, when I was CEO of Reebok, my supply chain costs were 6%. Why are yours 50%?
Yeah, right.
If you think about it that way, that's why you're seeing these new market entrants like Mark Cuban, for example, and other smaller, more transparent PBMs, because 50% inefficiency in the supply chain is not sustainable.
No, it's not. And I think you've summed it up well, right? Because we find that it's just crazy that there's insurance coverages that generate revenue with some of these other programs, not just the rebates, but also with their utilization management programs, copay maximizers, accumulators, alternative funding programs, other things like that. So there are a lot of inefficiencies in the process. And I know that pharma sort of has tried to tackle a lot of these big topics, right, from a policy perspective, because it's one thing to let the market work, like what's happening with some of the cash pay stuff, but it's another thing to have policy in place that will actually drive change. So I don't want to sort of start going through the letters here, the IRA, the MFN, the others. So I'll let you sort of go through, tell us, what are some of the big policy things you're hoping to get in place that'll impact access and affordability in particular?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think that, as you mentioned at the outset, I have announced my departure by the end of the year. So it's a little bit of a time of reflection of sorts. And one of the things I'm most proud about in my tenure is putting the organization on offense and driving specific policies with an eye towards policies that actually lower what patients pay for their medicine and improve access to those medicines. And, pharma has always been known as an organization that's very effective at pushing back on bad policy ideas. But the muscle around developing, new innovative approaches and specific policy ideas to try to address some of these challenges was not as well developed. People didn't know what a PBM was, when I first got here. Some of the worst actors in the industry were really defining the industry. So you had Martin Shkreli, for example, the EpiPen in the news and so forth. And, I think we rebuilt the team. I'm a big acolyte of Jim Collins. I'm sure you're aware of his work, Good to Great, Built to Last. But, Collins talks about, building teams, getting the right people on the bus and the right seats on the bus. And we have, just a terrific team here at Pharma. But then we set about like really trying to open the aperture on the drug pricing discussion. So rather than having a discussion like we were having myopically about the list price of the drug, we wanted to open the aperture and really look at what are all the actors involved in that have a bearing on what patients ultimately pay for the medicine at the pharmacy counter. And that led us to really an examination of the 50 cents on the dollar that goes to somebody else that doesn't make the medicine, and notably focusing on PBMs and 340B hospitals. And with regard to PBMs, we all know the issues now. It was really a multi-year effort to define the problem, identify some solutions, work in coalition with providers, pharmacists, taxpayer organizations and others to really drive this reform effort. But if you step back from it, you have 3 PBMs, they control 80% of the market. They're capturing these massive rebates and discounts that don't flow through to the patients. They're marking up generic medicines significantly. They're paying their own pharmacies more than community pharmacies. I mean, as they've consolidated and vertically integrated, it has created these inefficiencies and dislocations that actually disadvantage patients and raise their costs. So we identified specific reforms to try to address that. And there have been 3 actions just in the last couple of months that I think are moving the system in the right direction. So legislation passed Congress, which we had been supporting for many years, that did 2 very important things. One is it, in the context of Medicare, it broke the link between how PBMs are paid and the list price of the drug, which is a very misaligned incentive that has this pernicious effect of actually PBMs who are created to lower costs. They actually prefer higher priced, higher rebated medicines. So breaking that link, we're not saying how they should be paid. They should be paid a market-based rate for the services they provide, but it shouldn't be based on the list price of the drug. So the legislation prohibits that in the context of Medicare Part D. It also requires a raft of new transparency elements that PBMs will have to report to the government in terms of retained compensation, rebate flows, and things that are very opaque today to policymakers and to consumers. So that's one component of reform. Then there was an landmark FTC settlement with Express Scripts, which included a number of the same provisions, but one I would single out is that for one of their offerings, they're required to offer employers an offering that ties the patient, what the patient pays, to the net price, not the list price. And ultimately, that's what we're after. We want patients to benefit from the fruits of the marketplace, not these intermediaries. So if in insulin, for example, there's a 50 to 80% discount, the patient should pay that, not the list price in the deductible phase. So, the third piece is Department of Labor has a rulemaking underway that will address the commercial market and also includes some of these transparency requirements. They're exploring fiduciary duty and other requirements for PBMs. So again, taken together, these 3 things I think are going to move the marketplace in the right direction. Implementation will be really important, and we'll be very focused on that. And then there's more work to be done. So we're not done here. I think, Mark, you alluded to the fact that there are these access barriers that remained. IQVIA just put out a study that showed that, for brand medicine, patients are denied their first script from a physician 70% of the time. And you pointed out some of the other access problems and vertical integration, these GPOs that PBMs have. offshore in places like Switzerland. That's also kind of low hanging fruit. Why does that exist? Why are we rebate dollars through foreign entities? And so, again, our work is not done, but I think there's significant momentum around reform, and these three developments, I think, will move us in the right direction.
Those are clearly some wonderful developments. I'd like to go back to the IRA and MFN and government involvement in drug pricing, and get your view on what's happening there.
Yeah, I mean, MFN, for your listeners who are not indoctrinated, it's a policy that would tie prices in the United States to a basket of countries outside the U.S. in Europe, for example, the G7. And our view is that that's not a good policy idea for a number of reasons. One is it won't help patients. At the end of the day, what we've learned from the IRA is even after the government sets the price, and the assumption is that patients are going to benefit from that lower price, it's not the case, because in our system, health plans and PBMs ultimately set the price that a patient pays at the pharmacy counter. And because of some of the pernicious effects and misaligned incentives that we were just talking about, oftentimes plans or PBMs will take the lower price medicine and put it on a disadvantaged part of the formulary because they make more money off the higher priced medicine. And until we get out some of those incentives, patients will not benefit from government set prices. So you get all the negative impacts of price controls. I mean, if you look at these European countries that have lower prices, what comes along with those lower prices? Typically, they get access to about half the new medicines that American patients have access to. It comes along with a huge bureaucracy to implement these programs, and they ration, medicines based on things like QALYs, for example, that ascribe a value to human life that's lower for seniors and people with disabilities, and that has been rejected by policymakers on both sides of the aisle in the U.S. Not to mention all the anti-innovation, anti-economic impacts of MFN. So, in our view, rather than importing these socialist price controls from other countries and risking all the patient access and economic national security related negatives that come with the policy, we should focus on three major distortions in our own market to level the playing field in a more productive way. Again, by addressing PBM reform, 340B reform, and this sort of 26% tax, if you will, on the fact that countries outside the U.S. don't pay their fair share for innovative medicines. And so, our view is rather than importing socialist price controls from other countries, we ought to focus on those three distortions, which would make a substantial headway in leveling pricing differentials across markets.
And Steve, just a finer point there, the 26% reference, what does that indicate?
Yeah, basically, we just measured the impact of systematically underpaying for innovative medicines in countries outside the United States. And that translates to about a 26% increase in prices in the United States to compensate for that systematic underpayment. So it amounts to about a 26% tax on U.S. consumers. And it's a little bit like the NATO dynamic where, the president's been correct and very focused on making sure these other countries contribute a greater share to their own defense. In this case, he's rightly focused on making sure that they're not free riding on investments in R&D that our companies are making with regard to innovative medicines.
If I could, I'd like to, you mentioned going on the offense, right? And it's been great because I love your ads. And you also created ads just for 340B, which I thought was great because 340B is one of those topics people don't quite understand. Tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, what is the problem and what can we potentially do about it?
Yeah, as I'm sure your listeners know, the 340B program was created. It's a well-intentioned program. It was designed to allow a relatively small number of hospitals at the time, between 50 or so to 100 hospitals that treat a high number of uninsured or underinsured individuals to allow them to access discounts on their medicines. Um, and this is a program that the industry supports. A lot of our critics say that we're trying to get rid of the program and so forth. That is not the case. But what has happened over time is that this program is now mushroomed beyond recognition, where we've gone from 50 hospitals to over 2,000 hospitals are accessing these discounts. And not to mention the sort of thousands of for-profit entities in the form of pharmacies and PBMs and others who, sort of service the back end of this program and are also benefiting. The program is now an $80 billion program. It's growing at 20% a year. And it's fueling, again, all kinds of distortions in the marketplace in the sense that it's fueling consolidation in the hospital sector. It's fueling, the prescription of higher priced medicines because, again, this arbitrage. Basically, it's not even a drug discount program anymore. It's a hospital market program. These hospitals can buy medicine for as little as a penny, mark it up by 1,000%. That arbitrage flows to them. There's no requirement that it be used to lower drug costs or healthcare costs for consumers. And it's become, a cash cow, frankly, for hospitals, and a massive cross subsidy from our industry to the hospital sector with very little patient benefit. I mean, there was a very comprehensive story in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. New York Times did a piece on Bon Secours hospital system in Richmond. And essentially what has happened in Richmond and is happening in other parts of the country is that large affluent hospital systems acquire a hospital in an underserved community solely for the purpose of accessing these 340B drug discounts that they can then redistribute across their hospital system. And worse than that, in the case of Bon Secours, after they acquire the hospital in the underserved community, they strip the hospital of its essential services. So the high-cost services like running an ER or cardiac care unit get stripped from the hospital. So, this is a program that is larger than the Medicaid program. It's larger than Medicare Part B and on a track to become larger than Medicare Part D. And while we have this raging debate about healthcare affordability, can you imagine if you had $80 billion that you could step back and re-examine this program to make sure that it's actually benefiting patients and lowering their costs? We have partnered with the community health centers. Again, there are hospitals that should have the benefit of these discounts, but they're concerned about the sustainability of the program. And one of the reforms that we've advocated together is a sliding scale based on income, where 340B resources would be used to lower patients' drug costs. I am heartened if you think about the PBM reform arc. It was a 7-8 year effort. As I talked about earlier, when I first got to pharma, nobody knew what a PBM was. We had to go through a problem definition, identifying policy solutions, building a coalition of support for those. I would say in 340B, we're still maybe in the middle innings, but I think there is a growing awareness of the abuse in the program and the growth of the program, and the fact that it's not serving patients' best interests. There have been oversight hearings in the Congress for the first time in many years. And I think you're seeing, the Congressional Budget Office, employers, and others looking at the impacts to the federal government in terms of spending, as well as employers who are forsaking rebates that they would otherwise get that are flowing through the 340B program. So I do think we're making progress. You mentioned the ads. A lot of it is still educating policymakers about this program. We actually announced one today that you'll see soon, that basically shows hospitals are using these things, 340B resources, to name stadiums, create executive spas, and things that have very little to do with healthcare, much less lowering patients' drug costs.
Yeah, I just want to follow that up because I think it's interesting for our listeners to understand that when you talk about employers, like how does it impact an employer? Well, people need to understand that when you have a commercial insurance and you go to a suburban sort of oncology center, and that's affiliated with that hospital that's even maybe in an urban area 50 or 100 miles away, but they're buying the drug under the auspices of that 340B hospital, and then they send it to the the infusion center, and they still charge the retail rate. The commercial rate is getting charged, while the price, as you said, will be pennies on the dollar. And
Yeah.
so that spread is just so enormous.
Yeah, no, it's we've documented the spread as high as 1,000%, 700%. These are taking medicines that are commonly used. Oftentimes, you'll have a community pharmacist, as you point out, or a contract pharmacy that is hundreds of miles away from the hospital in question. It used to be that you had to go to the hospital and be a patient of the hospital to get the benefit of the discount. Now there's an increasingly tenuous relationship between that hospital care and patients accessing these benefits, and increasingly patients, affluent patients and others that were clearly not intended to be the benefit of the program.
Steve, I'd like to turn to the early innovation ecosystem a bit. And obviously, there's some great news there, as you mentioned earlier, about the developments in science and in technology and what that makes possible for the future. But there's also been some stress and strain there. Disruption in the NIH, is an example. Some ups and downs in venture capital availability for investment. And now the industrial policy in China and the effectiveness of that and the rise of China in the early innovation ecosystem. Could you share some perspective on those kinds of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we lead the world in the development of better treatments and cures. It's not by accident. It's because we have this world-leading ecosystem that really is the envy of the world, and it's built on
Yep.
4 pillars: strong intellectual property protection, a transparent and efficient regulator in the FDA, at least up until recently, with the advent of the IRA and some of these MFN policies, a marketplace that still rewards new innovation with market-based policies. And then the 4th pillar is really around collaboration. The BiDole infrastructure that allows our companies to partner with academia, to access outside capital, and to everyone sort of shares in the fruits of that collaboration. And I think we've seen that those 4 pillars have all come under some level of duress in recent years, against a backdrop of China, which has been very intentional, right? They're in their 15th 5-year plan. They've identified the biopharmaceutical industry as one of 3 so-called pillar industries. They're putting massive resource into research and development, incentives for manufacturing, et cetera, and it's working. I mean, if you look at phase 1 trials in China, 10 years ago, it was 5% of global trials being originated by Chinese companies. Today, it's 30%. And for context, U.S. companies originated 35%. So dramatic increase. It's 50% faster and 40% cheaper, to do a trial, phase 1 trial in China today than it is in the U.S. There's lots of other dimensions too. I mean, if you look at 8 of the 10 largest academic research universities, 8 out of 10 are Chinese universities. I think Harvard is the only one based in the U.S. They're graduating 4 to 5x the STEM grads that we are. And so this is not the China that people think about from 20 years ago, stealing IP and developing Me Too medicines or generic medicines. They're on the cutting edge and rapidly flattening their curve on the science. And so whether it's immunotherapy, cell and gene therapies, you can look at another metric of outbound licensing as a proxy for quality. It's tripled in the last year to $130 billion in out licensing. So our companies are seeing the value of these innovations. It's high quality data. They're seeing signals early in acquiring a lot of these assets. And at some level, cancer patients don't care, right? Which,
Right.
if the medicine comes from China that saves their life or it comes from the United States. But on the whole, we want to make sure that these investments are happening in the US for a lot of reasons. Again, our patients get access, in months as opposed to years, 3 months as opposed to 3 years in some cases. We want the economic benefits of advanced manufacturing R&D investments in the United States. And from a national security perspective, we want to make sure that we're not dependent on any other country. I mean, if you look at the COVID era, I don't think any of us would want to think about, being
Right.
dependent on a Chinese vaccine. So there are lots of really compelling reasons why we want to make sure that the U.S. ecosystem continues to be nurtured so that we can perform better. I think it's a fool's errand to try to slow China down.
Yeah.
It's impossible to do in terms of the resources and the intentionality behind what they're trying to do. But we can make reforms in the US, for example, to close the gap with China in phase 1 trials and to make other reforms in our system and to avoid, frankly, harm at home, throwing sand in the gears with policies like MFN or the IRA, ensuring that we have a robust funding level for FDA, for NIH, CDC, et cetera, this basic science infrastructure where we lead the world.
Wow. Well, what makes you hopeful? You talked earlier about there are some cures. I know you're a parent of a son with type 1 diabetes. So what
Yeah.
makes you hopeful when you look at the pipeline and the research?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, type 1 is really a relentless disease. Having, lived with somebody that has the disease, you have this much deeper appreciation for the issues that we work on. And, my son is 22. He's a senior in college. Having type 1 means you have to constantly calibrate, matching insulin injections with the carbs that you're consuming. And, there's layers of complexity beyond that. It's a bit like sailing. So you have to like factor in the wind and the current and lots of other variables in your day-to-day life. You may be under stress, you're taking finals or exercising or, all these things that you have to worry about. And if you go too high, that can have a negative impact, and too low can be life-threatening. So I walked through that just because it's I had hoped that when I was leaving pharma 10 years later that there'd be a cure for type 1, and there's still not. I think there's some promising research, which I'll talk about in a moment, but it's a great reminder for me of a couple of things. One is the science is really hard. If you think about type 1, it's not unlike many other diseases that are unmet, clinical needs, in the sense that there are lots of genes that are implicated. It's very difficult to develop new medicines. And the other thing it reminds me of is just that patients are waiting. That for all the issues that we're talking about, and we tossed around a lot of acronyms today, at the end of the day, there are lots of patients who are focused every day on something better that's going to improve their life. And, Vertex, which is a company and has a type 1 program, does have a very exciting platform. I mean, basically, they have developed a way to develop at scale the pancreatic cells that can replicate insulin production, which was very challenging to do. And they've, been able to demonstrate that they can inject these cells and they can replicate the function of the pancreas. Unfortunately, you still have a situation where the body's immune response, the T cells, still see those cells as foreign and attack them. And so the next, problem to solve is really how to protect those cells in a way that allows blood to flow through but keeps out the T cells, and so you're not on immunosuppressive medicines for the rest of your life, which have other side effects. So it's a long digression into how hard the work is and how exciting, the prospect of new medicine can be. And I'm an optimist. I really do believe at the end of the day that, thanks in part to the work that our companies are doing, the work we do in Washington, that people are rightly focused on making sure the system is sustainable, but they want to make sure that we continue to lead the world in the development of new treatments and cures, and that patients ultimately have access. I mean, I've spent time in the hospital industry, the medical device industry, and pharma, and the reality is chronic disease drives an overwhelming share of healthcare spending. And if you really drill down in those costs, they're in institutional costs. They're in hospital labor costs in hospitals and physician care. And the only thing that really holds promise to ameliorate those costs long term are better treatments and cures. I mean, we spend $250 billion a year on obesity and the sequelae tied to obesity in this country. And GLP-1s are going to revolutionize the way we treat those patients and pull costs out of the system. I read the other day that airlines will spend $250 billion less in jet fuel because of the advent of GLP-1s. And just you start to think about the residual benefits to our healthcare system, our economy, our society as a whole in terms of caregiver burden. And that just is one example of how I think we're at a real tipping point in how our industry is going to benefit patients in the healthcare system.
Yeah. Awesome. Amazing. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here today, Steve. Thank you for that. And Mark and I always wrap up our discussions with our guests with a final question. If you had the magic wand, and what you would use it for. So what's your prescription for better access?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first answer is rationalizing the supply chain. We have to get at this 50 cents on the dollar that goes to intermediaries and not patients. So rationalizing, PBMs and 340B, I think would significantly lower patient costs in the US. The second thing I would say is this competitiveness dynamic, that we spoke about with China. The history of the industry is actually, if you go back to the 80s, a lot of the industry R&D was located in Europe. It was in places like the UK, Switzerland, Germany, and through a combination of what I would argue are bad policy decisions in Europe, notably imposing price controls on the industry, but other tax and regulatory policies, coupled with really smart decisions that the US made at the same time, notably the Hatch-Waxman Act, which allows for access to generic medicines on in a predictable way, and 90% of prescriptions, by the way, are generic medicines, and we're the only thing in healthcare where the price goes down over time. And not only Hatch-Waxman, but I mentioned Buy-Dole, and other tax and regulatory policies in the U.S. So what happened over about a 20-year period in the 80s to the early 2000s is about a 60-point swing in high-value R&D investments moving from Europe to the United States. And the question, I think, going forward is, are we going to nurture this ecosystem and make decisions that keep those investments and focal point in the United States, or are we going to cede that leadership to China? Because I think we've seen this movie before, and I'm a little bit concerned that policymakers have this dated notion of China and don't realize how tenuous our leadership is, and why we need to, again, nurture these four pillars I mentioned earlier. So, I think magic wand would be the supply chain and really focusing on these competitiveness dynamics that would lead you to make better policy decisions in the United States.
Amen. No, that's great. That's great, Stephen. Thank you so much for joining us.
A couple things struck me, Mark, including the beginning and the conclusion, and one thing in particular in the middle I'll call out. But I think the framing of what a paradoxical time it is in the industry, that the science and technology have never been better, and but there are these policy and business and other headwinds that are never been more challenging as well, is a really important observation. In the middle, what really struck me was the commitment to the necessity of the commitment to stay kind of forward leaning in the policy world, and with the PBM reforms as a really great example of that. It took a lot of effort for a lot of time to finally result in what appears to be some positive movement in terms of the PBM reform. And then lastly, the conclusions. I like the two magic wand tricks, and it's especially good to be able to turn one magic wand trick into two. And so but the notion of rationalizing the supply chain is, of course, fundamental. We all understand that, the need for that. And it's the only right and fair thing to do for patients, frankly. But then also continuing to support and nurture the innovation ecosystem here at home in the U.S. is also incredibly important. So lots of great things.
No, absolutely. A lot of great things. I guess I would add also that the role of awareness of the consumer is underappreciated. And I think Steve sort of hit on it. He mentioned it a couple times. I think it we should sort of put a spotlight on it. And that is, changing perception takes decades, generations to change this perspective, right? And we're now at the point now where the consumers are not just blaming, drug companies for high drug costs, right? Because I've lost both my parents, but I remember the example when my mom was trying to get antibiotic drops, and she's like, I can't believe I had to pay $110 for these drops. And I looked it up and I was like, it was $11. Your pharmacy made $100 on this, and the supply chain and the rebates. And yes, it was a vertically integrated. And so changing the perception is so hard to do. And I think that's been, I don't want to say, there's so many great things that Steve will have done in his time at pharma, but I think changing that will have been one of his great accomplishments. So now we got to use that momentum to get these things across the finish line, right?
Yeah, agreed.
And that's for our next few episodes. So
good.
So we look forward to that.
Well, thanks for joining us, Steve. It's been wonderful to be able to talk with you, and best wishes.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed being with you, Mark and Scott.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you to everybody. Thank you to all of our listeners, our growing listener group base. And so we appreciate it. As always, we listen to all of our comments and read all of our comments. So send in any to comments@prescriptionforbеттeraccess.com. And we will be thrilled to respond and give us your suggestions. So thank you all, and look forward to seeing everybody soon. See you, Scott.
Thanks, Mark.
Resonate.